Hi there. In order for you to understand the three branches of our government, you kind of have to have some background knowledge of where our Constitution started and where it is now. Um, when you ask most high school students about our Constitution, they think, well, the Constitution was written in 1776 and we've had it ever since. Well, that's just not the case. Originally, our first Constitution was called the Articles of Confederation, and there was a vast difference between the Constitution that you see today and the Articles of Confederation that we had originally. Originally, the foundations of our articles, the choice was made that since a new country was being fought for, that in order to be taken seriously as a country, our country needed a binding constitution. The Second Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft this new government. A man named John Dickinson was chosen as chairman. It was submitted to the Continental Congress in July 12th, 1777, and it was completely ratified by all except for Maryland by 1779. This article was our first binding constitution. Now, it was called the Articles of Confederation because a confederation is a loose alliance among states. And basically, that's all it was. It was a very loose alliance among very separate, different states. They wanted to be taken seriously as a country, but they still wanted to be free and sovereign, really, from each other as a whole. It's almost like the United Nations. Yes, the United Nations is a combination of all these different countries coming together and trying to get something done, but technically they are all still sovereign or completely different countries. Um, so more background. So the Articles of Confederation, first of all, it was a unicameral legislature, meaning it was a single house. We didn't have three branches in the original articles. We only had one branch, and that was the legislative branch, which makes sense because of the country that they came from. They came from a monarchy. This monarchy had one ruler, and that ruler made most of the rules along with Parliament. The colonists wanted to make sure that that kind of stuff didn't happen. They didn't want one person making all the rules. They thought that it was a good idea to make sure that we had multiple people making the rules and everybody had an equal say. Each state could send between 2 to 7 representatives. Each state would only have one vote, so there was only 13 votes total. It didn't matter about your population at this time. In order to create a new law, it required a 2/3 vote, which meant 9 out of 13 states, which made it extremely hard to pass any new laws, which made it even harder to actually amend the Constitution, was that it had to be a unanimous decision. So starting off, the Articles of Confederation made it difficult for the federal government to pass anything over our state governments. It was created that way for a reason. They wanted to make sure the state government still had the majority of the power. They didn't want a federal government ruling them all. The powers given to Congress under the Articles sound very good. First of all, they're allowed to declare war and make peace with other countries. They're allowed to make treaties with other nations. They're allowed to send and receive ambassadors to other nations. They handled Indian affairs. They could coin, which means make, and borrow money from other countries if the Congress passed it through. They could set up a national post office. They could settle disputes among states, supposedly. They could admit new states to the nation, and they could set up an army and a navy. Now, when you look at that, it sounds very similar to the Constitution that we have today. But even though they had these rights, they really had no way of enforcing or taking advantage of these rights. Some of the strengths and weaknesses. Most of the power was held by the states. Now, some people might put that in the weaknesses, but some people might put that in the strengths. That's really up to you. The Land Ordinance of 1785. It surveyed land. It was able to kind of break up the lands into these square mile blocks and turned these square mile blocks into different townships. That's why when you go to bigger cities in the Midwest, It's split up into a grid system. If you go into Detroit, you'll be able to see, okay, this is, 13-mile road, 14-mile road, 15-mile road. Those are all grid systems split up because of the land ordinance of 1785. Now, if you go to Boston, on the other hand, or any of these older cities on the East Coast, you'll see that the way that things are set up there is all the roads are very curvy. There's these back alleyways, and you don't get that in more of a Midwest type town because of this. It also set up the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which allowed the Northwest Territory, which is Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and Wisconsin, to be split up into 3 to 5 states. Basically, there was only, they had to make sure that they had a constitution, they had to have a legislative branch, they had to have a certain amount of free men living there, and then they could create 3 to 5 states out of that territory. They wound up creating 5, okay? Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. It allowed extradition of criminals. So if you committed a crime in one state and ran to another state, that state could then extradite you back to the state that you committed the crime. They allowed each state to accept the laws of the other states. And they allowed citizens to move freely between states, so you didn't need a passport or anything. Now, the weaknesses, there are a lot of them. There were no executive or judicial branches. So even though, back on this slide, it says they can make treaties with other nations and declare war and peace and send ambassadors and do all of this stuff, without the other 2 branches, it made it extremely difficult to do. Especially this one, settle disputes between states. Without a judicial branch, there was really no way of settling these disputes. Each state was allowed to print its own money. So even though the federal government was allowed to coin and borrow money, states were creating their own money. And that money wasn't worth anything when you went to different states because every state had its different type of money. Congress could ask but not be forced, could not force states to send troops for national use. So back here again, where is it? Set up an army and a navy. They could set it up, but there was no way of getting troops unless somebody joined voluntarily. There was no way of drafting troops into the army. Like I said earlier, it took 9 out of 13 states to agree on a bill. It made it almost impossible to pass anything through. And Congress did not have the power to tax people directly. So even though the United States just got out of this extremely expensive war, the federal government had no way of paying their war debt back to the other countries. Basically, it was up to the states to pay back, their state debt, and that was it. It was kind of like one for all and all for myself, except for, yeah. All right, finally, the wake-up call came in 1787 with Shays' Rebellion. The plan was to attack the arsenal at Springfield, it was in Massachusetts, and then overtake the courthouse and destroy tax records. Shay was a farmer who was getting taxed and was upset about this. Now, Shay and his men, which were mostly his sons, arrived at the arsenal to find it guarded. The army fired one round into the approaching crowd, and they dispersed, leaving several dead, and the plot completely foiled. George Washington brought his army down to disperse Shays' Rebellion, which it did. But this rebellion kind of shocked the country into thinking that, okay, things needed to change. And because of that, our Constitution was ultimately written by the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, which you guys will be talking about here within this module.